Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale sat in his darkened study, headphones pressed tight against his ears, listening for the third time to a recording that should not exist. It was January of 2019, and what he heard through those headphones had already cost him his career, his security clearance, and nearly his life. The voice on the recording was his own from 7 years earlier, transmitted from the cockpit of an LC-130 aircraft during what should have been a routine transport flight from McMurdo Station to the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica. But what the recording captured was anything but routine. His own voice, younger and filled with an excitement bordering on terror, described seeing structures emerging from the ice that shouldn't exist, objects in the sky that moved in ways that defied physics, and receiving radio transmissions from a source that identified itself as being located beneath the ice sheet, coordinates classified. The recording had been erased from official systems twice, first within hours of his landing and again 3 weeks later when he made a backup copy from cockpit memory. But Hale had anticipated this. He'd made a third copy, recording the audio to his personal phone during playback before the second erasure could occur. That phone recording, degraded and containing background noise but still comprehensible, was all that remained of evidence documenting one of the most extraordinary flights in aviation history. If you're fascinated by suppressed evidence and by the lengths authorities go to erase information they find inconvenient, then subscribe and turn on notifications, because what we're about to explore represents one of the most thoroughly buried incidents in modern military aviation. Share this with anyone who understands that erased doesn't mean forgotten. And if this investigation resonates with your sense that some truths are too significant to stay hidden forever despite official efforts at suppression, leave a like to help this reach others who search for what lies beneath the sanitized versions of events we're given. The fact that Hale's cockpit recording was erased twice isn't evidence of routine data management or technical failure. It's evidence that what the recording contained was deemed so sensitive that extraordinary measures were taken to ensure it could never be heard by anyone without the highest security clearances, and even then, only by those with a specific need to know. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale was 41 years old in 2012 when he flew the mission that would define and ultimately destroy his military career. He was an experienced pilot with over 4,000 flight hours, including combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan and multiple Antarctic deployments. He had flown support missions to both McMurdo Station and the South Pole Station on several previous occasions, making him familiar with the challenges of Antarctic aviation, including the rapidly changing weather, the lack of navigation aids in the vast white emptiness, and the disorientation that can affect pilots flying over terrain with no visual references. His experience and his reputation for careful, by-the-book flying made him an unlikely candidate for hallucination or fabrication, which is precisely why his testimony was taken seriously by those who debriefed him after the flight, and why the recording of what he observed was immediately classified at levels that exceeded typical operational security. The flight began normally on December 8, 2012. Hale was piloting an LC-130 Hercules transport aircraft loaded with supplies and scientific equipment destined for the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. The flight plan called for a direct route from McMurdo on the Antarctic coast to the geographic South Pole, roughly 800 miles inland, a flight that would take approximately 3 hours under normal conditions. The weather forecast was favorable with clear skies predicted along the route. Hale's crew consisted of a co-pilot, a navigator, a flight engineer, and 2 loadmasters responsible for the cargo. All were experienced Antarctic hands who had made similar flights multiple times. The LC-130 took off from McMurdo's sea ice runway at 0800 hours local time and climbed to cruising altitude, turning south toward the pole. For the first 90 minutes, the flight proceeded exactly as planned. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, and the aircraft's systems functioned normally. The crew maintained routine radio contact with McMurdo, transmitting position reports at regular intervals. The vast white expanse of the Antarctic ice sheet stretched endlessly below them, featureless and monotonous in a way that was simultaneously beautiful and unsettling. Hale noted in his recording that he'd been on autopilot monitoring systems, but not actively hand-flying the aircraft, when the first unusual event occurred. The aircraft's magnetic compass began fluctuating wildly, the needle spinning through complete rotations despite the gyroscopic compass remaining stable. This type of magnetic disturbance isn't uncommon near the magnetic South Pole, which is located roughly 120 degrees away from the geographic South Pole, but the intensity of the fluctuation was unusual and caught the navigator's attention. Within minutes of the magnetic disturbance beginning, Hale's co-pilot pointed out the cockpit windows toward the surface and asked if Hale was seeing what he was seeing. Hale describes in his recording looking down and observing something that initially seemed like a trick of light or ice formation, but that became increasingly clearly artificial as he continued to observe. Emerging from the ice sheet were what appeared to be straight edges and geometric patterns, visible through a section of clearer ice, or perhaps through an area where ice coverage was thinner than usual. The pattern suggested structure rather than natural formation, with right angles, parallel lines, and symmetrical arrangements that geology doesn't produce randomly. Hale reduced altitude from 30,000 feet to 20,000 to get a better view, and as the aircraft descended, the structures became more clearly defined. What he was seeing appeared to be walls, foundations, or other constructed elements of buildings or facilities buried beneath varying depths of ice. As Hale circled the area containing the visible structures, maintaining altitude and attempting to photograph them using the aircraft's external cameras, the situation escalated from unusual to extraordinary. The flight engineer reported detecting radar contacts approaching from the east, multiple objects moving at high speed and at altitudes that varied erratically. Initially assuming these might be other aircraft despite no scheduled flights being in the area, Hale attempted radio contact using standard aviation frequencies. He received no response. The radar contacts continued to approach, and within minutes they became visually observable to the crew. What they saw were objects that Hale describes in his recording as disc-shaped or possibly cylindrical when viewed from certain angles, approximately 30 to 40 feet in diameter based on visual estimation, and moving in ways that no conventional aircraft could match. The objects approached to within approximately 2 miles of Hale's LC-130 and then paced the aircraft, maintaining formation alongside for several minutes. Hale describes attempting various maneuvers, changes in heading and altitude, to see if the objects would follow or react. They did, matching every change instantly, and maintaining their relative positions with precision that suggested either remote control or conscious piloting with capabilities far exceeding anything in the known aerospace inventory. The objects displayed no visible means of propulsion, no wings, no exhaust, no jet or rocket signatures. They simply moved, accelerating and decelerating without apparent concern for the physical forces that would crush pilots and destroy airframes in conventional aircraft attempting similar maneuvers. Hale's recording captures his voice describing these observations with remarkable calm given the circumstances, maintaining professional pilot demeanor even while reporting phenomena that challenged everything he understood about aviation and physics. The navigator attempted to contact McMurdo Station to report the situation, but radio communications had become garbled with heavy static despite clear weather conditions. They could transmit but couldn't clearly receive responses, hearing only fragments of words through the interference. This communication difficulty persisted for approximately 20 minutes while the unknown objects maintained their escort formation. Then, according to Hale's recording, the radio suddenly cleared and they received a transmission that was not from McMurdo. The voice was calm, professional, speaking English with what Hale describes as a neutral accent, neither clearly American nor foreign, identifying itself as Antarctic Monitoring Station Alpha and instructing Hale to alter course to specified coordinates roughly 100 miles east of his current position. The voice stated that he had entered restricted airspace and that compliance with the course correction was strongly advised for the safety of your aircraft and crew. Hale faced an immediate decision with no good options. The voice on the radio claimed authority over airspace that, according to all official charts and flight plans, was not restricted, at least not to his knowledge. He had orders to deliver his cargo to the South Pole Station, and deviating from his flight plan without clear authorization could result in disciplinary action. But he was also responsible for his crew's safety, and the presence of unknown objects that had demonstrated technological superiority suggested that compliance might be wiser than defiance. In his recording, Hale notes that he requested verification of the radio transmission's authority, asking for authentication codes that would confirm the source was legitimate military or government. The response he received was unexpected. "Lieutenant Colonel Hale, we are not military in the sense you understand, but we do have authority over certain Antarctic regions, including the one you are currently transiting. Please comply with the course correction. You will not be harmed, and your cargo will reach its destination with minimal delay." The fact that the unknown voice knew his name and rank was significant. That information wasn't being transmitted by his aircraft's transponder, which only provided the aircraft's identification code and altitude. Someone monitoring his flight had accessed personnel information, either through networks connecting Antarctic operations or through some other means. Hale made the decision to comply, altering course to the coordinates provided, while explaining to his crew that they would be investigating what appeared to be a security situation, but that he believed their safety would be maintained. The unknown objects accompanied them as they changed heading, maintaining their escort formation. The flight engineer noted that the objects' radar signatures periodically vanished from the scope only to reappear seconds later, suggesting they possessed some form of stealth capability or could manipulate their detectability. The coordinates they had been directed to were located in a region of East Antarctica that Hale's chart showed as ice sheet with no notable features. As they approached the area, descending gradually per instructions from the unknown radio voice, Hale observed something that made no sense given the location. Below them, visible through a break in the typical uniform ice coverage, was what appeared to be an ice-free area roughly 2 miles in diameter. The surface in this area wasn't snow and ice, but appeared to be rock or possibly even vegetation, dark patches that contrasted sharply with the surrounding white. The temperature readings from the aircraft's external sensors showed the ambient air temperature rising as they descended, reaching above freezing as they approached 10,000 feet altitude, despite their location deep in Antarctica's interior, where temperatures should be far below zero even during the summer season. The radio voice instructed Hale to land at a set of coordinates within the ice-free area, stating that a prepared surface would accommodate his aircraft. Hale expressed skepticism about landing at an unprepared site, noting that LC-130 aircraft require substantial runway lengths and that attempting to land on unknown terrain could be catastrophic. The voice responded that the surface had been prepared for your arrival, and that visual inspection on approach would confirm it was suitable. As Hale circled the area, assessing the landing site, he observed what indeed appeared to be a cleared strip roughly 6,000 feet long and 100 feet wide, more than adequate for the LC-130's requirements. The surface looked like compacted ice or possibly concrete, hard to distinguish from altitude, but clearly distinct from the surrounding terrain. With fuel considerations beginning to become a factor and with the unknown objects still maintaining their escort, Hale decided to attempt the landing. He describes in his recording the surreal experience of descending toward a prepared runway in one of Earth's most remote locations. A runway that appeared on no charts and that shouldn't exist according to any official documentation. The landing was smooth, with the surface proving solid and providing good traction. As the aircraft rolled out and slowed, Hale observed several structures near the runway perimeter, buildings or facilities that appeared to be partly subterranean with only portions visible above the surface. The architecture was unusual, featuring smooth curves and a lack of right angles that made the structures appear organic or sculptural rather than following typical engineering conventions. As the aircraft came to a stop, Hale maintained engines running and kept the crew at their stations, unsure what would happen next. The unknown objects that had escorted them landed nearby, settling onto the surface without any visible landing gear, but simply resting on their lower surfaces. Personnel emerged from the closest structure and approached the aircraft on foot. Hale describes them as appearing human, dressed in what looked like uniforms of a design he didn't recognize, moving with purpose and without apparent concern about the cold despite the Antarctic location. One individual approached close enough to be clearly visible through the cockpit windows and made a gesture that Hale interpreted as requesting permission to communicate. Hale opened the crew door, and the individual approached the aircraft's entrance. What followed was a conversation that Hale recorded in its entirety, a discussion that lasted approximately 45 minutes and that covered topics ranging from why Hale's flight had been intercepted to what activities were being conducted in this hidden Antarctic facility. The individual who had approached the aircraft introduced himself using a name that Hale recorded phonetically as Darren, or possibly Darren, acknowledging that his English name was an approximation and that his actual designation would be difficult for Hale to pronounce. Darren explained that he represented a group that maintained several facilities in Antarctica for purposes that he couldn't fully disclose, but that involved both research and what he termed custodial responsibilities related to the continent. He stated that Hale's flight had crossed into a region where this group maintained operational security. And while they generally avoided interfering with surface human activities in Antarctica, direct overflights of sensitive facilities required interception and temporary diversion. Hale asked the obvious questions that any pilot in his situation would ask. Who was this group? What authority did they have to operate in Antarctica? And why weren't their facilities and airspace restrictions documented in official materials that pilots used for flight planning? Darren's responses were carefully worded but revealing. He stated that his group had been present in Antarctica far longer than modern human civilization has existed, and that their facilities predated the ice sheet that currently covers most of the continent. He acknowledged that they operated outside the framework of surface governments and international treaties, maintaining their presence through a combination of advanced technology that allowed them to remain undetected and through what he called accommodation arrangements with certain elements of various national governments who were aware of their existence and who agreed to maintain secrecy about their presence in exchange for limited information sharing. Regarding the structures visible beneath the ice that had initially caught Hale's attention, Darren stated that these were ruins of installations that his group once maintained on the surface before the climate shifted and ice coverage expanded. As conditions changed, the group relocated to facilities that were either underground or protected in the few remaining ice-free areas like the one where Hale had landed. The thermal characteristics of these locations, warmer than typical Antarctic conditions, resulted from what Darren described as geothermal management systems that tapped into Earth's internal heat and used it to maintain livable conditions in the immediate vicinity of their facilities. He emphasized that these systems were carefully controlled to minimize environmental impact and to avoid creating obvious thermal signatures that would attract attention from satellites or from researchers monitoring Antarctic conditions. The tone of the conversation shifted when Darren addressed why Hale's group had chosen to make direct contact rather than simply monitoring his flight and allowing him to continue. He stated that increased human activity in Antarctica over recent years had brought more flights and research operations into proximity with their facilities, creating risks of accidental exposure that concerned his group. They had been observing surface human development for millennia with minimal direct intervention, but certain recent developments, he specifically mentioned expanded satellite surveillance and advanced ground-penetrating radar systems, threatened to reveal their presence in ways that would be problematic for both parties. His group was therefore selectively making contact with certain individuals from various nations' Antarctic programs to communicate that some regions needed to remain restricted and that respecting those restrictions was in everyone's interest. Darren explained that his group had no hostile intentions toward surface humanity and actually had invested interest in surface civilization's success and stability. However, they maintained capabilities to defend their facilities and to ensure their continued secrecy if necessary. He stated that the objects that had intercepted Hale's aircraft were unmanned systems capable of a range of defensive actions, including disabling aircraft electronics if required, though he emphasized they would use such capabilities only if they perceived direct threats. The purpose of intercepting Hale and bringing him to the facility was partly to communicate these boundaries and partly to assess his reaction and trustworthiness. Darren stated that Hale had been selected for contact because intelligence about his background suggested he would handle the encounter professionally and would understand the importance of maintaining confidentiality about what he had observed. At this point in the recording, Hale asked whether he and his crew would be allowed to leave and whether they would face consequences for the knowledge they now possessed. Darren assured him that they would be released without harm, but that their testimony about the encounter would not be believed if they reported it through official channels, and that attempting to publicize the encounter widely would result in personal and professional consequences as authorities worked to discredit them and suppress the information. He suggested that Hale would face a choice between maintaining silence about what he had experienced or facing the destruction of his career and reputation if he chose to speak openly. Darren expressed what seemed like genuine regret about this situation, but stated that his group couldn't prevent surface authorities' responses and that Hale needed to make informed decisions about how to handle his new knowledge. After the conversation concluded, Darren provided Hale with updated coordinates and instructions for reaching the South Pole Station, routing him around the sensitive areas and providing clearance to depart. The cargo delivery to the South Pole would proceed as originally planned, though several hours behind schedule. Hale describes in his recording the process of preparing for departure, the surreal experience of normal flight procedures conducted in a completely abnormal context. With unknown facilities visible outside the cockpit windows, and with the knowledge that what he had just experienced contradicted everything he thought he understood about Antarctic operations and about the limits of human civilization's reach on Earth. The crew boarded, the engines spun up, and the LC-130 taxied to the prepared runway for takeoff. As Hale lifted off and climbed away from the facility, he observed it growing smaller below them, the structures and the landed objects becoming less distinct until they were simply features in the ice-free area that wouldn't be recognizable for what they were from altitude. The escort objects rose with them, but broke away once the aircraft had cleared the restricted region, departing at speeds that took them beyond visual range in seconds. The flight to the South Pole Station proceeded without further incident, though Hale notes in his recording that the crew remained silent for much of the flight, each processing what they had experienced and likely considering what they would say when they inevitably faced questions about the delays and the course deviations that McMurdo Station's radar would have tracked. They landed at the South Pole Station approximately 4 hours behind their original schedule. The cargo was unloaded, routine post-flight procedures were completed, and Hale filed his flight report noting equipment issues and navigation challenges that had required course deviations and had extended the flight time. He didn't mention the interception or the landing at the unknown facility, partly because he wanted time to consider how to handle reporting the encounter, and partly because he suspected that any immediate report would be met with disbelief and potentially with psychiatric evaluation. The crew agreed informally to discuss their experience only among themselves until they had returned to McMurdo and had time to assess the situation. Hale describes the return flight to McMurdo the following day as tense, with each crew member clearly preoccupied with their own thoughts about the previous day's events. Upon returning to McMurdo Station, Hale was immediately summoned to meet with the station commander and with several individuals whose presence had not been explained but who Hale suspected were intelligence or security personnel based on their questions and demeanor. The meeting began with what seemed like routine flight operation review, discussing the schedule delays and the course deviations. But the questioning quickly became more pointed, with specific inquiries about what Hale had observed during the flight, whether he had encountered any unusual phenomena, and why his aircraft's transponder data showed an approximately 2-hour period where altitude and position data were inconsistent with normal flight profiles. Hale describes in his recording, made some time after this debriefing, that he realized the meeting was not routine, but was specifically focused on his encounter with the unknown facility. Hale made a decision in the moment to be truthful about what he had experienced, believing that attempting to conceal the encounter would be both dishonest and ultimately futile, given that his flight had clearly been monitored and that authorities already suspected or knew what had occurred. He described the magnetic anomalies, the structures visible through the ice, the objects that had intercepted his flight, the radio communications, the landing at the facility, and his conversation with Darren. He emphasized that the encounter had been non-hostile and that he had been provided with routing information to avoid future conflicts. The officers conducting the debriefing listened without interruption, taking notes and occasionally conferring in low voices. When Hale finished his account, the senior intelligence officer present informed him that his testimony was being classified at the highest security level and that he would be required to sign non-disclosure documents prohibiting discussion of the events with anyone lacking appropriate clearances. Hale was also informed that his cockpit voice recorder and any other recordings or data from the flight were being confiscated for analysis. He surrendered the recording equipment, though he had already made the mental note that he wanted to preserve his testimony somehow before it could be disappeared into classified systems. Over the following days, Hale was questioned repeatedly, each session covering the same events but probing different aspects, clearly attempting to assess the consistency of his account and to extract every detail he could recall. He was also subjected to psychological evaluation, ostensibly standard procedure after unusual incidents, but clearly aimed at determining whether he was mentally stable and whether his account could be attributed to stress, hallucination, or other psychological factors rather than to actual events. Approximately 1 week after the flight and after the initial round of debriefings, Hale requested access to the cockpit recording to review his own account and to prepare written documentation for the classified files. He was informed that the recording had been reviewed and transcribed, but that the original media had been damaged during the confiscation and transfer process, resulting in the loss of the audio. A transcript would be provided to him for review, but the actual voice recording was no longer available. Hale describes his reaction as a combination of frustration and suspicion. The cockpit voice recorder used in LC-130 aircraft was robust equipment designed to survive crashes and fires. The casual explanation that the recording had been damaged during transfer seemed implausible and suggested deliberate destruction rather than accident. Hale pressed for more information about what had happened to the recording, seeking to speak with the technical personnel who had supposedly handled the media and damaged it. These requests were stonewalled, with officials stating that the matter was closed and that the transcript was sufficient for documentation purposes. When Hale reviewed the transcript, he found that while it captured the basic sequence of events, it was sanitized in ways that removed the most extraordinary elements. References to the advanced capabilities of the unknown objects were described in vague language as unusual flight characteristics. Darren's statements about his group's long presence in Antarctica were paraphrased as claims of unauthorized occupation. The overall effect was to make the incident seem less extraordinary, to present it in language that could be interpreted as confusion or exaggeration, rather than as documentation of contact with an unknown advanced group operating in Antarctica. Hale refused to sign the sanitized transcript as an accurate representation of events, noting in writing that the document didn't reflect his actual observations and statements. This refusal was noted in his file and contributed to what would become increasingly difficult professional circumstances. However, his refusal to authenticate the altered transcript also meant that the official record remained ambiguous, with Hale's handwritten notes and the sanitized transcript both existing in the classified files, but neither being accepted as the definitive account. This ambiguity, Hale later suspected, was actually preferable to authorities than having a clear authoritative account that they would either have to accept or explicitly discredit. Hale had anticipated that his cockpit recording might be confiscated or destroyed, and he had taken precautions. Modern LC-130 aircraft cockpit voice recorders use solid-state memory that can be accessed via data ports while the system is powered. During post-flight procedures, before anyone had indicated interest in the recording, Hale had connected a portable device to the cockpit voice recorder system and copied the audio files. This backup copy was stored on a small thumb drive that he kept in his personal possession. After learning that the official recording had been damaged, Hale retrieved his backup and listened to it repeatedly, confirming that his memory of events matched what the recording documented. He decided to make a transcription of the backup, creating a written record that would preserve the content even if the backup itself was discovered and confiscated. For 3 weeks, Hale maintained possession of the backup without incident. He had not told anyone about its existence and had taken care to store it separately from his other belongings, anticipating that searches of his quarters might occur if authorities learned he had retained evidence. But during this period, he received notice that he was being transferred from Antarctic duty to a posting at a base in the continental United States, effective immediately. The transfer was described as routine rotation, but its timing seemed suspiciously coincidental, coming just weeks after his extraordinary flight and while the debriefing process was still ongoing. Hale suspected the transfer was intended to remove him from Antarctica before he could make additional observations or before he could discuss his experience with other personnel who might take his account seriously. Before departing McMurdo, Hale decided to review the backup recording one more time to ensure it was functioning properly for future playback. He connected the thumb drive to his laptop in his quarters and opened the audio file. What he heard was silence. The file existed and had the correct size and timestamp, but the audio content had been erased, replaced with dead air. Hale describes the sinking feeling of realizing that somehow, despite his precautions, the backup had been discovered and remotely wiped. The technology for remotely accessing and erasing data from devices existed, particularly for military equipment and in environments with comprehensive network surveillance like McMurdo Station. Someone monitoring network traffic or with access to his laptop might have detected the backup file and deleted it without physical access to the thumb drive itself. This second erasure confirmed Hale's suspicions that preserving evidence of his encounter was being actively prevented by authorities who wanted no record to exist, but Hale had made a third copy, one that he created specifically because he anticipated that sophisticated technical means might be used to erase digital files. Several days before the second erasure, he had played the backup recording and had recorded it using the voice recording function on his personal phone, holding the phone near the laptop speakers while the cockpit audio played. This method was crude and resulted in degraded audio quality with background noise and reduced fidelity. But it captured the essential content, his voice describing the events as they occurred, the radio communications with Darren, and the statements made during the meeting at the facility. This phone recording existed as a standard audio file on a device that Hale kept with him constantly, and that was not connected to any military networks, making it more difficult to remotely access and erase than files stored on his military-issued laptop. When Hale discovered that his backup thumb drive had been wiped, he immediately checked his phone recording. It remained intact. He made 2 additional copies, storing them on separate devices and in cloud storage accounts that were not associated with his military identity, using personal email addresses and storage services that would be difficult to trace to him. These precautions reflected Hale's growing understanding that he was dealing with adversaries who had substantial technical capabilities and who were determined to prevent documentation of his encounter from surviving. The third copy, the phone recording, would prove to be the only evidence that persisted despite multiple attempts at suppression. Hale departed McMurdo Station and returned to the United States, carrying with him physical devices containing the phone recording and knowledge that backup copies existed in cloud storage. Over the following months, his career trajectory deteriorated, despite his previously excellent record. He was assigned to administrative duties rather than flight operations. His requests for transfers to flying positions were denied. His security clearance was repeatedly reviewed with increasing scrutiny, and he began to receive informal suggestions from colleagues that he should consider early retirement, that his career had reached its peak, and that attempting to continue would likely result in disappointment and frustration. These pressures seemed designed to encourage him to leave military service quietly, rather than remaining in the system where his presence might create ongoing complications. For 5 years after the Antarctic flight, Hale maintained silence about his experience outside of the classified debriefing process. He followed the instructions he had been given, he signed the non-disclosure agreements, and he didn't discuss the encounter with anyone lacking appropriate clearances. But as his career continued to stagnate, and as he faced increasing pressure to retire, he began to reconsider whether maintaining silence was serving any legitimate purpose or whether it was simply protecting authorities who wanted to suppress extraordinary information for reasons of institutional convenience rather than genuine security needs. In 2017, Hale retired from military service at the rank of lieutenant colonel, having been passed over for promotion to full colonel despite what had been a distinguished career prior to his Antarctic experience. Once retired and no longer subject to military discipline, Hale faced a choice about whether to go public with his story. The non-disclosure agreements he had signed technically bound him for life, but he questioned whether those agreements should apply to information that served public interest and that revealed government knowledge of phenomena that all humanity should be aware of. He consulted with attorneys who specialized in whistleblower protections and government secrecy, seeking advice about the legal risks of disclosure. The advice he received was sobering. Disclosing classified information, even after leaving government service, could result in prosecution under espionage statutes that carry severe penalties, including potential imprisonment. However, the attorneys also noted that prosecutions of retirees who disclosed information years after the fact were relatively rare, particularly when the information disclosed didn't involve ongoing operations or specific intelligence sources and methods. After extensive deliberation, Hale decided to share his story with select researchers and journalists who focused on Antarctic mysteries and government secrecy. He provided them with copies of the phone recording of his cockpit audio, explaining how it had been the only surviving evidence after 2 erasures. He also provided documentation of his military service, his flight record showing the flight in question, and correspondence related to the debriefing and clearance reviews. His goal was not publicity or personal gain, but rather ensuring that information about the encounter would be preserved and disseminated beyond his own personal memory, creating a record that would survive regardless of what happened to him personally. The researchers and journalists he contacted verified his credentials and authenticated the recording to the extent possible, finding no evidence of fabrication or manipulation that would discredit the audio as a genuine cockpit recording. The consequences of Hale's decision to speak out were swift and severe. Within weeks of his first contacts with researchers, he received visits from unidentified individuals who claimed to be conducting official reviews related to his clearance status, even though he was retired and no longer held active clearances. These individuals asked pointed questions about whether he had retained copies of classified materials, whether he had discussed classified information with unauthorized individuals, and whether he understood the legal consequences of breaching non-disclosure agreements. The visits were clearly intended to intimidate, to remind him of the risks he faced, and to discourage further disclosure. When Hale stated that he had already shared information and would continue to do so because he believed the public interest outweighed the classification, the visitors became more explicit in their warnings, noting that prosecution remained possible and that his pension and benefits could be jeopardized if he were convicted of security violations. Hale also experienced more subtle forms of pressure. His personal finances came under scrutiny with tax audits that, while ultimately finding no irregularities, consumed significant time and created stress. His medical records were requested for unspecified administrative reviews. His neighbors received visits from individuals asking about his behavior and mental state. These tactics, characteristic of how authorities handle individuals they want to silence, create environments of stress and paranoia that discourage continued resistance. But Hale had anticipated these responses and had prepared psychologically for them. He maintained detailed documentation of all contacts and pressures, creating a record that would serve as evidence of retaliation if legal proceedings ever occurred. And he continued to speak with researchers, providing additional details and context about his Antarctic experience and about the suppression efforts he had endured. In late 2018, Hale narrowly survived what was officially ruled an accident, but which he believes was an attempted assassination. While driving alone on a highway, his vehicle's brakes failed catastrophically, and only his quick reactions allowed him to bring the vehicle to a stop using the emergency brake before it crashed. Subsequent investigation of the vehicle found evidence of brake line tampering, though no suspects were identified, and the local police investigation concluded without resolution. Hale interpreted this incident as an escalation, suggesting that authorities were willing to use lethal force to silence him if other pressures proved insufficient. This attempted killing, if that's what it was, paradoxically strengthened his resolve rather than intimidating him into silence, as he concluded that if authorities were willing to go to such lengths, the information he possessed must be even more significant than he had realized. Within the community of researchers investigating Antarctic mysteries and government secrecy, Hale's account and his recording generated significant interest, but also debate about authenticity and interpretation. Some researchers accepted his testimony at face value, seeing it as compelling evidence from a credible witness that confirmed long-standing theories about hidden facilities and advanced groups operating in Antarctica. Others were more skeptical, questioning aspects of the story, and noting that the only surviving evidence was a degraded phone recording that could potentially have been fabricated, or that might represent misinterpretation of ambiguous events rather than documentation of the extraordinary encounter Hale described. These debates reflected broader divisions within the research community between those who are predisposed to believe that governments hide extraordinary information and those who maintain more skeptical positions requiring extensive corroboration before accepting claims that challenge mainstream understanding. Audio forensics experts who examined Hale's phone recording generally agreed that the audio appeared genuine in the sense of being an actual cockpit recording rather than a studio creation. The acoustic characteristics, the background noise from aircraft systems, and the radio communications all matched what would be expected from a recording made in an LC-130 cockpit. However, experts noted that the degraded quality of the phone recording made definitive authentication impossible. They couldn't conclusively rule out sophisticated fabrication or heavy editing, though they also found no specific evidence suggesting either had occurred. The most they could say with confidence was that if the recording was fabricated, it was done with considerable skill and attention to detail. Aviation experts who reviewed Hale's account noted several elements that aligned with their understanding of LC-130 operations and Antarctic flying: the timing of the flight, the route described, and the technical details about aircraft systems all were consistent with actual operations. However, they had difficulty accepting the claims about unknown objects displaying flight capabilities far beyond conventional aircraft. Some suggested that Hale might have misidentified unusual meteorological phenomena or might have observed experimental aircraft from classified programs that, while advanced, didn't necessarily represent the kind of physics-defying capabilities his account suggested. These alternative explanations, while possible, required assuming that Hale and his entire crew misperceived events, or that classified aircraft programs existed with capabilities that would represent breakthroughs comparable to the unknown group's technology. Official responses to Hale's disclosures followed a predictable pattern of neither confirming nor denying. When journalists contacted the Air Force and other defense agencies seeking comment on Hale's claims, they received statements noting that operational details of Antarctic flights were sometimes classified for security reasons, and that the government couldn't discuss classified operations or respond to claims about such operations. These non-responses allowed authorities to avoid either validating Hale's account or explicitly disputing it, maintaining ambiguity that served their interests better than definitive statements would. By refusing to engage with the substance of Hale's claims, authorities also avoided drawing additional attention to them, calculating that stories without official confirmation would receive limited mainstream media coverage and would be primarily confined to alternative research communities where they could be more easily dismissed. Congressional oversight of classified programs theoretically provides mechanisms for investigating claims like Hale's without requiring public disclosure. However, no evidence has emerged that congressional intelligence committees conducted any investigation into his allegations. Whether this reflects committee members' assessment that the claims lacked credibility, whether it reflects coordination between executive and legislative branches to maintain suppression, or whether any investigations occurred in such secrecy that no information leaked, remains unknown. The absence of congressional response is notable, given that credible allegations of erased evidence and retaliation against whistleblowers should trigger oversight mechanisms regardless of how extraordinary the underlying claims might be. Some researchers have noted that the pattern of official response to Hale's case closely matches responses to other instances where military personnel reported encounters with unknown advanced craft or technologies. Initial classification and confiscation of evidence, debriefing with secrecy requirements, career consequences for those who report, and eventual erasure of physical evidence all appear as recurring elements across multiple cases spanning decades. This pattern suggests institutional protocols for handling such encounters, protocols that prioritize suppression and control over investigation and disclosure. Whether these protocols reflect legitimate security concerns or represent inappropriate suppression of information that should be more openly investigated remains a point of contention between transparency advocates and those who support broad classification authorities. If Hale's account is accurate, the technologies he observed raise profound questions about their origin, capabilities, and implications. The objects that intercepted his aircraft displayed capabilities that would represent multiple revolutionary breakthroughs in aerospace engineering: propulsion without visible reaction mass, instantaneous acceleration and deceleration that would crush human pilots, precise maneuvering at speeds exceeding conventional aircraft by orders of magnitude, and possibly some form of radar stealth or manipulation. Any one of these capabilities would be extraordinary. All of them together suggest technologies based on principles that mainstream physics either doesn't understand or hasn't successfully implemented. The facility where Hale landed presents equal mysteries: a prepared runway in one of Earth's most remote locations, structures partly buried or built into terrain, thermal management systems that maintain above freezing conditions in the Antarctic interior, all suggest infrastructure that required enormous resources and capabilities to construct and maintain. If Darren's claims about his group's long presence in Antarctica are accurate, this infrastructure might be very old, potentially predating modern human civilization, raising questions about how it has remained functional and hidden for millennia. Alternatively, if the infrastructure is more recent, its construction would have required logistics and technologies that should have been detectable by satellites and by the extensive monitoring that multiple nations conduct of Antarctic activities. The communication technology Hale experienced, radio transmissions that knew his name and rank, and that could guide his aircraft to specific coordinates, suggests sophisticated surveillance and information gathering capabilities. If Darren's group can monitor flights and access personnel databases to identify individual pilots, they possess intelligence gathering capabilities that extend beyond their immediate Antarctic territory into the broader world's information systems. This raises uncomfortable questions about the extent of their monitoring and about what other information they might have access to. It also suggests that their choice to maintain secrecy is active rather than passive, that they're not simply hidden by isolation, but are actively managing their exposure through technological means that allow them to detect and respond to potential threats to their secrecy. Hale's encounter in 2012 was not the first time that pilots or other personnel have reported unusual observations or encounters in Antarctic regions. Operation High Jump in 1947, various incidents during the Cold War period, and more recent reports from researchers and support personnel have created a pattern of Antarctic anomalies that Hale's experience fits within. Whether these historical cases and Hale's encounter all relate to the same phenomena, whether they represent encounters with the same group Darren represented, or whether multiple different unknown groups or activities operate in Antarctica remains unclear, but the pattern suggests that whatever Hale encountered is not new but is part of a long-running situation that multiple nations' governments have been aware of and have chosen to suppress rather than publicly acknowledge. Some researchers have attempted to correlate Hale's account with geographical features and scientific observations of Antarctica. The region where his flight was initially intercepted corresponds to an area of East Antarctica where geophysical surveys have detected magnetic anomalies and where ice-penetrating radar has shown unusual subglacial topography. Whether these scientific observations relate to the structures Hale described seeing, or whether the correlation is coincidental, is impossible to determine without more specific location data that Hale either didn't record or has not disclosed. The ice-free area where he landed doesn't appear in any publicly available satellite imagery, though advocates argue that such areas could be concealed through image processing or selective release of satellite data, preventing researchers from confirming or refuting claims about warm zones in Antarctica's interior. The Antarctic Treaty Regime, established in 1959, created international governance of the continent that emphasized scientific research and environmental protection while prohibiting military activities and territorial claims. Some researchers have speculated that the treaty's true purpose, beyond the publicly stated objectives, was to create a framework for managing knowledge of the unknown groups operating in Antarctica, ensuring that no single nation could monopolize contact or access while maintaining collective secrecy about their existence. Whether the treaty's negotiators were aware of Antarctic anomalies and incorporated provisions to address them, or whether the treaty served such purposes inadvertently through its general restrictions on activities, remains debated among those who study the treaty's history and its classified dimensions. Why would Darren's group choose to make contact with Hale rather than simply monitoring his flight and allowing him to pass through without direct interaction? Hale's recording captures some explanation. They were concerned about increasing human activity, bringing more flights near their facilities, creating risks of exposure. But this explanation raises as many questions as it answers. If the group has technologies capable of monitoring and intercepting flights, they presumably could continue doing so without direct contact, simply redirecting aircraft away from sensitive areas without explanations. The choice to make contact, to explain their presence, and to provide warnings suggests motivations beyond simply avoiding detection. Perhaps they calculate that selectively revealing themselves to certain individuals creates better outcomes than maintaining absolute secrecy. As informed pilots who understand the importance of avoiding certain regions might be more reliable than enforced redirections that leave pilots confused and potentially filing reports that draw unwanted attention. Another possible motive relates to the warnings Darren provided about respecting restricted regions. By making direct contact and explaining that certain areas are off limits, Darren's group establishes a communication that might prevent future conflicts or misunderstandings. If pilots know that restricted regions exist and understand that violating them will trigger responses, they can incorporate this knowledge into flight planning and can avoid situations that might escalate dangerously. This represents a form of deterrence through information, using limited disclosure to prevent situations that would require more aggressive responses. However, this motive assumes that the pilots contacted will maintain confidentiality, which Hale ultimately didn't do, raising questions about whether the group's assessment of him was flawed or whether they anticipated that he might speak out, but calculated that the benefits of contact outweighed the risks. A third possible motive involves gathering information about surface human capabilities and intentions. By intercepting Hale and engaging in conversation, Darren had opportunity to assess surface human technology, to observe how a military pilot responded to extraordinary encounters, and to gather intelligence about Antarctic operations from Hale's perspective. The meeting might have been as much about gathering information as about providing it, with Darren using the interaction to update his group's understanding of surface activities and attitudes. If Darren's group has been monitoring surface humanity for millennia, as he claimed, periodic direct contacts would provide valuable calibration for their observations, confirming or correcting assumptions they make based on remote monitoring alone. 7 years after Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale flew into Antarctica and experienced events that would define and destroy his career, the fundamental questions raised by his encounter remain unanswered. Does Darren's group still maintain their facilities beneath and around Antarctic ice? If so, do they continue intercepting flights that approach too closely? Or have they adjusted their security procedures in response to Hale's eventual disclosure? Have there been additional contacts beyond Hale's case, either with him or with other pilots, that remain classified or unreported? What are the true purposes of the facilities that Darren's group maintains, beyond the vague references to research and custodial responsibilities? And perhaps most importantly, what does the existence of an advanced group operating secretly in Antarctica mean for humanity's understanding of Earth's history, and for the future of human activities on the continent? These questions remain unanswered partly because the only substantial evidence is Hale's degraded phone recording, compelling to those inclined to believe, but insufficient to convince skeptics who require more extensive corroboration. The two erasures of his cockpit recording ensure that better quality evidence doesn't exist in accessible form, if it exists at all. Whether copies remain in classified systems, preserved for the few with need-to-know access, or whether the erasures were comprehensive and permanent, is unknowable to those outside those systems. Hale's willingness to speak despite legal risks and personal consequences demonstrates his conviction that what he experienced was real and significant enough to warrant disclosure, but individual conviction doesn't resolve uncertainties for those who weren't present during the encounter. For researchers investigating Antarctic mysteries, Hale's case represents both frustration and validation. Frustration because the evidence has been systematically degraded and because official confirmation will likely never be forthcoming. Validation because the pattern of suppression, the multiple erasures, and the consequences Hale faced all suggest that something significant occurred, that his account touched on truths authorities wanted hidden. If his story were simply a fabrication or misunderstanding, the response would likely have been dismissal rather than the extensive efforts at erasure and the ongoing monitoring and pressure he experienced. The severity of the response suggests that what Hale documented represents genuine threats to institutional interests in maintaining secrecy about Antarctic activities. What happens next with Hale's case and with the broader questions it raises depends on multiple factors outside any individual's control. Will additional witnesses from that flight or from other similar encounters decide to speak publicly, adding corroboration to Hale's account? Will technological advances in satellite imaging or other remote sensing reveal features in Antarctica that support claims about hidden facilities and ice-free regions? Will political changes lead to different approaches to government secrecy, with new leadership deciding that disclosure serves interests better than continued suppression? Or will the pattern continue with encounters documented, evidence erased, witnesses silenced, and the truth remaining hidden behind classification barriers that prevent the public from knowing what their governments have discovered about Antarctica and about the other intelligences that apparently share this planet with humanity? For Hale personally, speaking out has been costly, but also liberating. He no longer carries secrets in silence, no longer bears the burden alone of knowing extraordinary truths while being prohibited from sharing them. Despite the legal risks, the financial pressures, and the possible threat to his life, he has chosen truth over compliance, deciding that some information is too important to remain hidden regardless of the personal consequences of disclosure. Whether his choice will inspire others in similar positions to come forward, whether it will contribute to eventual broader disclosure, or whether it will simply add another case to the long history of suppressed information that's never fully resolved, remains to be seen. But his decision ensures that his experience is documented, that his recording exists in multiple copies beyond authorities' ability to completely erase, and that future researchers and citizens will have access to his testimony as they assess what governments know about Antarctica and why that knowledge remains classified. The cockpit recording, erased twice but surviving in degraded form through Hale's precautions, stands as testimony to both the extraordinary nature of what occurs in Antarctica and the determination of authorities to prevent that extraordinary reality from becoming public knowledge. The recording captures a voice describing the impossible, reporting observations that challenge comfortable assumptions about who and what inhabits Earth, documenting warnings and explanations from sources that shouldn't exist according to official narratives. That such a recording exists at all, despite two erasures, represents a victory for truth over suppression, for individual courage over institutional pressure, and for the principle that some discoveries are too significant to remain forever hidden in classified vaults where only the privileged few can access them, while the rest of humanity remains ignorant of profound truths about the world we all share. One crucial aspect of Hale's case that has received less attention than it deserves involves the other crew members who were aboard the LC-130 during that December flight. Hale was not alone in the cockpit. His co-pilot, a navigator, flight engineer, and two loadmasters all witnessed at least portions of the events he described. These individuals represent independent corroboration of Hale's account, assuming they would be willing to testify about their experiences. However, tracking down and obtaining testimony from these crew members has proven extraordinarily difficult, suggesting that they too have been subjected to pressures that prevent them from speaking openly about what they observed. Researchers who have attempted to locate and interview Hale's crew members have encountered consistent obstacles. Two of the crew members have died in the years since the flight, one in a vehicle accident similar to what Hale experienced, and another from rapidly progressing cancer. While these deaths could be purely coincidental, the timing and circumstances have raised suspicions among those familiar with the case. The remaining crew members have proven reluctant to discuss the flight, with some refusing all contact and others providing only the most minimal statements that neither confirm nor deny Hale's account. This pattern of silence could reflect continued compliance with secrecy oaths, could indicate fear of consequences similar to what Hale has experienced, or could suggest that crew members genuinely don't recall the events as Hale describes them, perhaps due to selective memory loss or deliberate psychological intervention. One crew member did provide a brief statement to researchers under conditions of strict anonymity, refusing to be identified by name, rank, or even to confirm which position he held on the flight. This individual stated that he did witness unusual phenomena during the flight, including objects that displayed flight characteristics beyond conventional aircraft and a landing at a facility that wasn't on any official charts. However, he also stated that he had been debriefed extensively after the flight, had signed non-disclosure agreements that he continued to feel bound by, and that he feared professional and personal consequences if he were identified as having spoken about the incident. He expressed sympathy for Hale's decision to go public, but indicated that he personally did not have the courage to face the consequences that such disclosure would entail. This anonymous testimony, while limited, provides at least some independent confirmation that Hale's account is not purely fabricated and that other witnesses to the events exist, even if they remain unwilling to speak openly. The question of why crew members remained silent while Hale chose disclosure is significant for understanding the pressures that enforce secrecy around these cases. Hale was the aircraft commander, the senior officer responsible for the flight, which might have given him a different perspective on his obligations and responsibilities compared to subordinate crew members who were following his orders. Hale also had reached retirement eligibility and had less to lose professionally than younger crew members who still had years of career ahead of them. And perhaps most significantly, Hale's personality and values led him to prioritize truth and transparency over personal security in ways that not everyone shares. These differences among witnesses explain why some choose disclosure, while others maintain silence even when they possess identical knowledge. Modern digital forensics capabilities offer possibilities for analyzing Hale's surviving phone recording in ways that might reveal additional information beyond what's audible to human listeners. Researchers with access to sophisticated audio analysis software have examined the recording looking for evidence of manipulation, for hidden frequencies or data channels that might contain additional information, and for any details that might help authenticate or contextualize the recording. These analyses have yielded mixed results, providing some interesting findings but not definitively resolving questions about authenticity or revealing hidden information. Spectral analysis of the recording shows acoustic signatures consistent with aircraft cabin environments, including background noise from engines and environmental control systems at frequencies and patterns matching LC-130 characteristics. This supports authenticity, as accurately recreating such acoustic environments would be challenging without access to actual aircraft. However, the degraded quality of the phone recording creates ambiguities, with some frequencies lost or distorted in ways that make definitive conclusions impossible. Voice analysis comparing Hale's voice in the recording to known samples of his speech shows consistent patterns in vocal characteristics, supporting that the voice in the recording is indeed Hale rather than an impersonator. But again, the quality limitations prevent absolute certainty. One intriguing finding from digital analysis involves faint signals detected in the background of certain portions of the recording, particularly during the radio communications with Darren. These signals appear to be in frequency ranges not typically used for aviation radio and show patterns that some analysts interpret as possibly being data transmissions rather than voice communications. If accurate, this could suggest that Darren's transmissions included embedded digital information alongside the voice communications, perhaps for purposes Hale would not have been aware of. However, other analysts argue that these signals are artifacts of the recording process or interference from electronic devices present when Hale made his phone recording, and that attributing them to intentional data transmission represents overinterpretation of ambiguous evidence. Attempts to enhance the recording quality using modern audio processing techniques have had limited success. While noise reduction and filtering can clean up some of the degradation, they can't recover information that wasn't captured in the original phone recording. The fundamental limitation is that Hale's phone recording was made by holding a phone near laptop speakers, introducing multiple stages of quality loss that cannot be reversed through post-processing. The best enhanced versions of the recording improve intelligibility of some sections where speech was unclear, but don't reveal new content beyond what Hale's original description of the events already covered. The digital forensics work therefore supports the recording's apparent authenticity, but doesn't provide the kind of definitive proof that would satisfy skeptics or reveal hidden dimensions to the encounter that weren't already documented. If Darren's claims about his group maintaining presence in Antarctica for millennia are accurate, it raises profound geopolitical questions about how modern nations should relate to this presence. Antarctica is governed through the Antarctic Treaty System, which assumes that the continent is uninhabited except for temporary scientific and support personnel from treaty nations. The existence of a permanent population maintaining advanced facilities would fundamentally challenge this governance framework, raising questions about sovereignty, territorial claims, and the rights of groups who were present before the modern treaty system was established. International law provides some frameworks for dealing with indigenous populations that predated colonial claims, but these frameworks assume that indigenous groups are recognized and that their existence is not disputed. In the Antarctic case, if Darren's group exists, they have been deliberately concealed from public knowledge, with no formal recognition of their presence or rights. This creates a legal vacuum where questions about who has authority over what regions, what activities are permissible, and how conflicts should be resolved have no clear answers. The Antarctic Treaty's provisions about sharing scientific information and avoiding military activities might have been intended partly to manage this situation, ensuring that contact with the hidden group would be peaceful and that no single nation would monopolize interaction with them. But if this was the intent, it was never stated openly and remained speculative interpretation rather than documented fact. The strategic implications of advanced technology existing in Antarctica also deserve consideration. If Darren's group possesses capabilities far beyond surface nations, they represent a form of power that doesn't fit into conventional strategic calculations. They could potentially neutralize military forces, disable satellites, or interfere with communications if they chose to do so. Yet they apparently prefer to remain hidden rather than exercising such power overtly. This suggests either that their capabilities are more limited than they appeared to Hale, or that they have strong reasons for maintaining their separation from surface civilization despite possessing technological superiority. Understanding their motivations and red lines, what would cause them to intervene more directly in surface affairs is strategically important, but currently based only on fragmentary information from the few contacts like Hale's that have been documented. Some researchers have speculated about whether major powers, the United States, Russia, China, or others, have established classified relationships with Darren's group, perhaps gaining access to limited technology transfers or information in exchange for respecting their territorial boundaries and maintaining secrecy about their existence. Such relationships would be among the most sensitive state secrets, known only to the very highest government officials and completely compartmented from normal intelligence and diplomatic channels. Evidence for such relationships is purely circumstantial, based on observations like unexplained technological advances, unusual Antarctic policies that don't have obvious conventional explanations, and the consistent international cooperation on maintaining Antarctic as a special governance zone despite broader geopolitical competitions. But circumstantial evidence is not proof, and without access to the most classified government files, these speculations remain unverifiable. Hale's account, if taken seriously, suggests multiple scientific research questions that deserve investigation, but that are unlikely to receive official support given the classified nature of the underlying phenomena. What geophysical processes create the thermal anomalies that Hale described, allowing ice-free conditions and above-freezing temperatures in Antarctica's interior? Are these anomalies natural, perhaps involving unusual volcanic or geothermal activity, or are they artificially maintained through technologies, as Darren claimed? How extensive are these warm zones? Are they limited to small areas around specific facilities, or do they represent more widespread phenomena? And what biological ecosystems might exist in these zones? Could they harbor unique organisms adapted to isolated Antarctic refugia? Systematic aerial and satellite surveys using modern thermal imaging could potentially map temperature anomalies across Antarctica, identifying warm zones that might correlate with the locations Hale described. Such surveys would be scientifically valuable, regardless of whether they confirmed claims about artificial facilities, as understanding Antarctic thermal characteristics has implications for climate research, ice sheet dynamics, and baseline environmental monitoring. However, conducting such surveys specifically to investigate claims about hidden facilities would likely require justifications that acknowledge those claims, which authorities have been unwilling to provide. The result is that the scientific research that could test Hale's account remains largely unperformed, leaving questions unresolved that could potentially be answered through systematic investigation. Ice-penetrating radar technology has advanced significantly in recent decades, allowing detailed mapping of subglacial topography and identification of features beneath ice sheets. Applying this technology systematically to regions where Hale reported seeing structures could determine whether geometric patterns suggesting artificial construction exist beneath the ice. Again, such investigations would be scientifically valuable for understanding Antarctic geology and ice sheet characteristics, but conducting them specifically in response to claims about hidden structures would implicitly acknowledge taking those claims seriously, which represents a political decision that scientific organizations might be reluctant to make without official support. The intersection of scientific capability and political will therefore determines what research occurs. And in cases like Hale's, where the political will is absent, the scientific capabilities remain unused for addressing the questions his account raises. Some independent researchers have proposed crowd-funded expeditions to investigate Hale's claims, using private resources to bypass the governmental and institutional barriers that prevent official investigation. These proposals face enormous logistical and financial challenges, as Antarctic operations are extraordinarily expensive and require capabilities that private groups typically lack. Access to Antarctica is also controlled through permit systems that could be used to prevent expeditions whose purposes authorities found problematic. Nevertheless, as private space exploration has demonstrated that wealthy individuals and organizations can accomplish what was previously restricted to governments, the possibility exists that private Antarctic expeditions might eventually investigate anomalies that official channels refuse to examine. Whether such expeditions would be permitted, whether they would find anything if they occurred, and whether their findings would be believed if they confirmed extraordinary claims, all remain open questions. Mainstream media coverage of Hale's case has been limited and generally skeptical, treating it as a curiosity rather than as a serious news story deserving investigative journalism resources. Major news outlets that covered the story at all typically framed it as former military pilot claims contact with unknown group in Antarctica, using language that emphasized the claimant rather than the claim and that implied skepticism through word choice and presentation. This framing serves to marginalize the story, placing it in the category of eccentric beliefs rather than in the category of serious allegations about government secrecy and suppressed information that would merit deeper investigation. The reasons for limited mainstream media engagement with Hale's case are multiple and mutually reinforcing. Journalists who cover stories making extraordinary claims about hidden civilizations or advanced technologies risk their professional reputations, as colleagues and editors often view such topics as beneath serious journalistic standards, regardless of the credentials of sources or the evidence presented. News organizations also face pressures from official sources, with government and military officials who are critical news sources for other stories potentially reducing cooperation with outlets that publish stories challenging official narratives about classified operations. And crucially, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, a standard that Hale's degraded phone recording and lack of official confirmation failed to meet for journalists trained to require multiple independent sources and documentary evidence before publishing controversial stories. Alternative media and independent journalists have given Hale's case more extensive and sympathetic coverage, conducting detailed interviews and investigating the background and context. However, alternative media operates with smaller audiences and less institutional credibility than mainstream outlets, meaning their coverage reaches primarily people already interested in topics like government secrecy and Antarctic mysteries, rather than reaching broader publics who might be unaware such controversies exist. The result is a bifurcated information environment where Hale's case is extensively discussed and debated in certain communities while remaining largely unknown in others, reflecting broader patterns in how controversial information circulates in the modern media landscape. Some journalists who investigated Hale's case but ultimately chose not to publish stories about it have privately expressed that while they found his testimony credible and his background impressive, they couldn't obtain the independent corroboration or official comment that their editorial standards required for publication. They also noted concerns that publishing stories based primarily on one source's claims, even when that source appears credible, opens them to criticism of poor journalistic practice and could damage their careers if the story is later discredited. These practical concerns about professional risk create barriers to coverage that are as effective as formal censorship in preventing certain types of stories from reaching mainstream audiences. The psychological toll of Hale's experience and its aftermath deserves attention as it illuminates the human costs of government secrecy and of being a witness to extraordinary events that can't be openly discussed. Hale has spoken about the isolation of possessing knowledge that most people won't believe, of being unable to discuss his most significant professional experience with family and friends, and of the constant stress of knowing that he faces potential legal jeopardy for disclosing information he believes serves the public interest. These psychological burdens are common among individuals who possess classified knowledge or who have experienced events that fall outside normal reality, creating a sense of separation from ordinary life that can be profoundly alienating. The attempted assassination, if that's what the brake tampering represented, added a layer of fear that has affected Hale's daily life. He has taken security precautions that most people would consider paranoid, varying his routines to avoid predictable patterns, being cautious about what he discusses over phone and internet, and maintaining awareness of his surroundings in ways that reflect genuine concern for his physical safety. Living with this level of vigilance creates chronic stress that impacts health and well-being, representing another cost of his decision to speak out. Hale has acknowledged that if he had known the full consequences of disclosure when he made his initial decision to share his story, he might have chosen differently, though he also states that now, having committed to the path of disclosure, he feels obligated to continue regardless of personal costs. Support from the community of researchers and from others who have experienced similar situations of possessing knowledge that can't be openly shared has provided some mitigation of the psychological isolation. Knowing that others understand the position he's in, even if they can't fully verify his specific claims, provides validation that helps maintain psychological equilibrium. Hale has also engaged in practices like journaling and documentation, creating detailed records of his experience and of the ongoing pressures he faces, which serves both practical purposes of preserving evidence and psychological purposes of processing his experiences through writing. These coping mechanisms, while helpful, don't fully resolve the fundamental challenge of living with knowledge that is simultaneously profound and contested, believed by some and dismissed by others, important but unable to be proven to skeptical audiences. Hale's case fits within a longer pattern of military and government personnel who have reported extraordinary encounters, particularly in Antarctica, and who have faced suppression of their testimony. Operation High Jump in 1947, various Cold War incidents, and more recent cases from the early 21st century all show similar characteristics: credible witnesses, immediate classification, suppression of physical evidence, career consequences for those who report, and long-term secrecy, it maintained through a combination of classification, intimidation, and discrediting of those who attempt to speak publicly. This pattern suggests institutional protocols for handling such cases, protocols that prioritize secrecy and control over investigation and disclosure. Examining these historical precedents reveals evolution in how suppression is conducted. In earlier cases like Operation High Jump, classification and military discipline were sufficient to enforce silence, as most personnel of that era accepted without question that classified information must remain secret. In more recent cases, as social attitudes have shifted toward greater skepticism of government authority, and as legal protections for whistleblowers have developed, authorities have had to employ more sophisticated methods of suppression, including selective discrediting, legal intimidation, and in some cases physical threats like what Hale experienced. The evolution of suppression techniques reflects broader changes in the relationship between government and citizenry, with authorities adapting their methods to maintain secrecy in environments where maintaining absolute control over information has become increasingly difficult. The historical pattern also shows that secrecy has limits and that information eventually emerges despite suppression efforts. Classified documents get declassified after decades, witnesses eventually speak despite oaths and threats, and leaks occur that provide glimpses of hidden programs and encounters. The challenge is that this eventual emergence often comes so long after events that most participants are deceased, physical evidence has been destroyed, and the information has lost some of its urgency and relevance. Hale's case is notable partly because he spoke relatively soon after his experience, while he retained clear memories, and while the physical evidence, degraded though it was, still existed in some form. Whether this timing will make a difference in how the case is ultimately received and assessed remains to be seen. Despite extensive analysis of Hale's case, fundamental questions remain unanswered and likely will remain unanswered unless additional evidence emerges or official disclosure occurs. Does the facility where Hale landed still exist and operate, or was it abandoned or relocated after the encounter? Does Darren's group maintain contact with surface governments through classified channels, or was Hale's interception and subsequent contact an isolated incident? What are the true purposes of the facilities this group maintains, and how many such facilities exist in Antarctica and potentially in other remote locations? What technologies do they possess beyond what Hale briefly observed, and what are the principles underlying those technologies? And perhaps most fundamentally, what is the nature and origin of this group? Are they descendants of ancient human civilizations? Are they a separate intelligent species that evolved on Earth, or is the situation more complex than these simple categories allow? These unanswered questions create space for speculation that ranges from careful analysis grounded in the limited available evidence to wild theorizing that incorporates every possible conspiracy and mystery into comprehensive narratives that explain everything but prove nothing. The challenge for serious researchers is maintaining discipline to acknowledge what is known, what is reasonably inferred, and what remains completely speculative, while also remaining open to possibilities that conventional frameworks exclude. Hale's testimony and his recording provide a foundation for knowledge, evidence from a credible source describing specific events. Everything beyond that direct testimony is inference and speculation. valuable for generating hypotheses, but requiring recognition that hypotheses are not facts regardless of how compelling they might seem. The fact that these questions remain unanswered reflects both the limitations of available evidence and the barriers of official secrecy. With better access to information, with cooperation from authorities who possess classified knowledge, with ability to conduct on-site investigations in Antarctica, many of these questions could potentially be resolved or at least better understood, but such access and cooperation are not forthcoming, and without them, researchers and citizens are left to work with fragments, with leaked materials, with testimony from individuals who spoke, despite pressures to remain silent, and with the understanding that comprehensive truth remains hidden behind classification barriers that may never be fully breached. The pilot who flew into Antarctica saw things that challenged everything he thought he knew about what was possible and about what existed in Earth's most remote regions. What he saw was recorded in cockpit audio systems that documented his observations in real time, providing evidence that could have settled questions about extraordinary Antarctic phenomena once and for all. But that recording was erased, not once but twice, by authorities determined to prevent documentation of encounters they preferred to keep hidden. Only Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Hale's foresight in creating a backup that survived the erasures preserved any evidence at all, and even that surviving evidence is degraded and incomplete compared to what the original recordings would have shown. The story of Hale's recording and its multiple erasures stands as a powerful symbol of the broader struggle between secrecy and disclosure, between institutional interests in controlling information and individual commitments to truth. That the recording was erased twice demonstrates how seriously authorities took the threat of its existence, how important they judged suppression of this evidence to be. That a copy survived despite the erasures demonstrates that determined individuals can preserve truth even when powerful institutions work to destroy it, and that the surviving copy is degraded and contested, believed by some and doubted by others, unable to definitively prove the extraordinary claims it documents, demonstrates the limitations of evidence when official confirmation is withheld and when systematic suppression creates ambiguities that serve those who prefer that certain truths remain unconfirmed. The pilot who flew into Antarctica has paid a high price for his decision to preserve and eventually share his recording. His career was destroyed, his security clearance revoked, his life threatened, his credibility attacked. But he has also ensured that his experience is documented, that future researchers and citizens will have access to his testimony, and that questions about what exists in Antarctica and what governments know about it will continue to be asked even if they remain unanswered. His legacy is the recording that survived, despite 2 erasures. A voice describing the extraordinary captured in audio that exists because one man decided that some truths are too important to stay hidden forever, regardless of how many times they're erased or how severely those who preserve them are punished for choosing truth over silence.